Today we are more into how we can inform protection and understanding how different theories can inform protection in the field. So this session is focusing on social networks as a tool for humanitarian protection. I would like to introduce you to Romina Cachia. Romina Cachia is a researcher at the University of Sevilla and a part-time lecturer at the University of Malta. Her research is focused on social networks, new media, mobility, misinformation, and open education. She holds a PhD in social psychology from the University of Sevilla and a Master's of Arts in digital media from the University of Sussex, the United Kingdom, and a Bachelor of Communications from the University of Malta. Previously, she worked as a researcher for the Institute for Prospective Technological Studies, a European Commission joint research center based in Sevilla, Spain. So, Romina, welcome.
Thank you.
And I give you the floor.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Christina and Enrique, for the really nice invitation to be part of the seminar. From the laboratory of Rede de Personal y Comunidades, we feel very honored to be part of the seminar here to talk to you about social network analysis. Okay, so I start with a photo which, when I saw it, I remember it had quite an impact on me. It's this photo by Mohammed Ilmi Adam. He's a 17-year-old, and it was taken by a Maltese photographer, Darin Zamitlupi, in 2003, and he was one of 67 other Somali immigrants that had arrived in Malta and almost didn't make it to Malta after, if it was not for intervention at sea. And I use this example. He's one of many of thousands and if not millions, because just to show you how one person, when there is displacement, whether it's forced, whether it's wanted displacement, the network changes. So this person had lost his parents because both of them had tried to escape from Somalia. So he was kind of being raised by relatives, so he had that network in Somalia. And then he escaped through Libya and through two other countries. And in each border, he was kind of building a new network at each border. And these ad hoc networks that are built by people who are being displaced can be very influential. They are networks being created by, made by people who are in the same situation. They are networks of urgency, of emergency, and you just need to connect with people because you have lost your previous network, your consolidated network that you have from a long time. So at each border, you create a new network, and you try to make that network work, and you also take a lot of decisions depending on the network that you have at that moment. So whether you take a boat or not, whether you will move to the other part of your trajectory. So this network, these ad hoc networks, can play a really important role in the decisions that you take. And for people who have lost their previous networks and are unable to reconnect with these previous networks, the network which they are making during their trajectories is kind of it's like a way of gaining normality. So this is just to give you a bit of an example of the presence of networks when it comes to humanitarian protection. Okay, so in this presentation, I will divide the presentation into three areas. So general introduction to social networks, then I will give you some main concepts of social network analysis and give you some examples from research. And then in the end, I will give you my humble opinion on how networks can be used as a tool for humanitarian protection. Okay, so we start with the general introduction. Okay. Of all the small grants given to social scientists following the Katrina disaster, nearly half of them, by the National Science Foundation, nearly half of them were concerned with some form of social network analysis and how the networks affected decision to leave during the storm, how they assisted or not persons after the storm, and how the changes in the environment affected social networks. So this is just an example to see how social network analysis is increasingly being used for intervention with the community, for protection, humanitarian protection, and there is a need for more funds to carry out social network analysis in this area. Okay, what is a network? In its most basic sense, a network is any collection of objects in which some pairs of objects have a relation. So the circle would be what we call a node, and the link between one circle and another would be an edge or a path. So this we are saying that 5 and 2 are connected. Networks have various forms. We'll see various kinds of networks today. But this kind of network shows that there is a reciprocal relationship between A and B. And the other one, we see that A gives something to B, but B doesn't give it back to A, but gives it back to C. It's a directed graph. Okay, according to Freeman, which we consider like a bit of a father to social network analysis, there are 4 main features that make social network analysis. So one, it is motivated by a structural intuition. So we use a lot of graphs to explain our data, but always these graphs give you an intuition that there is something in the structure that is prompting you to look at the data and analyze the data further. It is grounded in empirical data. It draws heavily on graphical imagery, so we always use almost always use graph to show the results of the studies. And the analysis is done based on mathematical or computational models. Okay, so this is an example of how networks was used in humanitarian aid protection. It's a study that was carried out after the Mozambique floods. And network analysis was used to examine the structure of inter-organization relations amongst 65 non-governmental organizations, so NGOs, involved in the flood operations. And they found that the international NGOs had a quite higher average centrality. I will explain these terms later, but just in simple terms, it means that they were very central in the structure of the network. And what does this signify in terms of humanitarian protection? Well, basically, it means that the local NGOs were kind of being pushed to the periphery of the network. And when the emergency period ended, and the international NGOs obviously started reducing their presence in Mozambique, one consequence was the collapse of the critical links within the humanitarian aid network. So in terms of local capacity and of disaster response and recovery and giving self-protection in the local context, the collapse from some important nodes from the network can be quite detrimental in a particular context, and can also be less efficient if there are future disasters, because the local NGOs have a big role to play. Okay, there are 3 types of social networks that we talk about. So one of them is the social-centric networks. These are networks that are closed by a boundary. When we study social networks, we always identify a boundary. So let's say I want to do the social network of this room, and I will see who knows who in this room. So it will be the boundary in this room, or it could be people within a company, or students in a classroom. So it's a very defined boundary, and then I can analyze the structure of this room, for instance. Then there is the second type, which is personal networks, and personal networks is a different type of approach. So in this case, I will ask each and every one of you to give me your network, and then I analyze those networks and see if there are any topologies that I can extract from those networks. So if it's in the classroom, I will social-centric network would have given me the structure of the classroom, and personal networks would give me each and every student and their network, so I can understand better how each and every student see their network. And then there is a third type of network, which is the open system networks. This is the networks which are most difficult to study because their boundaries are not defined. So this could be something, let's say, it could be in the humanitarian aid protection, let's say, refugees in a camp, perhaps you're not able to be able to see all the refugees, because some of them might be in transition, some of them might be in another location. So it's difficult. So perhaps this could be an open systems network. So we're discussing where the boundaries are not always clearly defined. Okay, when we collect data, there are three different ways of collecting data. There are various ways, but this is the most typical approach that we use. So we use a matrix. So I ask A and B, do you know each other, for instance? And if they know each other, I put 1. If they don't know each other, it's 0. Or do you give support to each other? So again, 0 if there is no support, and 1 if there is support. Another type of way of collecting the data is using some software applications. So the second image, the image in the middle, is by a program called VenMaker. And here I will work with the respondent, and I will ask, I will use a name generator. So I will ask him, who are the people you rely to if you need help, if you need instrumental help, for instance, or who are the people you would talk to if you need emotional support. And there I will, the person will start naming the people, and then I will ask the person, and do these people know each other, for instance? And this is the relations. And so the people are actually creating visualization with me. And then from this kind of visualization, for instance, the software allows you to extract the matrix. So it does the matrix for you. And when we have the matrix, we normally put it in another program called PASJAC or UCNet, a network analysis program. And there we study the structure. We never rely on the visualization, ever. The visualization is just to give you intuition, and it can give you a lot of correct intuition. But we always go back to the data to examine that our intuition is correct. So we go to the empirical data. The third kind of approach is the most easiest way to do, but it's the most, let's say, it's more tedious, especially if you want to create the data manually later. You can ask the people to draw their network. I have used this approach. It's a really nice approach to work with the. I have used doing both, so using the drawing and using the in two-step approach for one research that we have conducted. And the drawing gives you so much about. We did this in migration. And the people really get talking when they draw their network. Most of these people have never seen their network displayed before in any format. It could be drawing, it could be automated. And it's quite interesting to see how when you kind of disclose, they are disclosing their own network. They especially for qualitative kind of data collection, they start talking things about their network, and they try to explain, listen, I don't have so many people in my country of origin, because since I've been living here 15 years, I actually now don't communicate with them anymore. So they start giving you a lot of data that perhaps you have not requested, but which is important for the interpretation of your data. And if you collect this kind of data, the drawing kind, then you have to do the matrix manually. And this can be quite tedious if you have 95 respondents, if you have 200 respondents, and you have to create the matrix. The matrix tend to be like 30 by 30, so 45 by 45. So it's quite a lot of manual. And the drawings as well might not be so accurate. Some people in the drawings, people tend to summarize the information. So try to collect people together in groups because they want to do it very quickly. And they want to make it visually pleasing as well. When you use the automated kind of network, people are more precise. And if you use the matrix, it probably is the most precise way. But of course, it's the most tedious as well. Okay, so I'll give you an example of how maps were used. This is a study conducted by the Roundtree Foundation in England. It was studied to explore why, although there was a lot of commitment by the UK government to improve the lives of some of the most excluded social groups, they were unable to generate self-sustaining improvements. So they did the study, and I'm just going to show you two approaches that they took to study using networks and visualization. So in the first image here, they asked people to draw their network. They draw a map of where they were living and show where the formal and informal activities were taking place. And then in the second kind of map, the one over there, they made these hand-drawn maps in central hubs, so roundabouts, next to schools, in places where shopping centers, where they were frequented by people. And they asked people to put stickers, so they used green stickers for places where they went, red stickers where they did not go because they did not feel safe, and the blue stickers to show where they lived. And just by seeing the network evolving, immediately, visually, you could see the dangerous the places where people do not go, just by looking at the colors by the stickers that they have been doing. So it's a nice way to use, to intervene with the community, using an approach which is very close to them, and which can immediately show you some possible results, which you then have to go back to your data to kind of prove, no? And from this study, one of the conclusions was that although there were many agencies working to improve these estates, the lack of coordination and common agenda between them, and the lack of understanding of what it is to be a resident in this community was what was actually hindering the improvement of these communities. So this is just an example of how network visualization could be used to intervene with the community. Well, now I'll show you another example. So this is a study we conducted in Seville, and it shows different people from different communities. And this is one case study from each community. And it just shows how the different community and the different type of mobility gives you a different kind of network. So the pie chart is divided into three. The purple one, the pink purple one, would be people living in Seville. The blue would be people living in country of origin. And the yellow would be people living in any other country. These are people that are mobile, so people who have been living in Seville at least 6 months. And you could see, for instance, if you look at the graph here on the right, on the left, sorry, you could see that this person, just by looking at this graph, you can see that this person is probably well settled in Seville. He has a lot of people in Seville, and the size of the nodes signify the strength of the social support they receive from these altars, from these people that they mentioned. So you see they have a lot of the most significant type of support is based in Seville. There are a lot of people from Seville. The nodes in red are people from Seville, and you can see that the people in the country of origin have decreased in size. So this gives us an indication that this person has either lived a long time in Seville or is quite settled in Seville. While if we look in this one from another community, you can see that the major support providers are still in the country of origin. The transnational network is not well connected. Like there you can see that the people from Seville and the country of origin are really connected between each other. There's a lot of foreigners when in the people that this person mentioned in Seville, only to people from Seville, and the major, as I said, kind of support is in the country of origin. So just by looking at these graphs, you can give like some assumptions about where this kind of data might be leading you to. Of course, we did not stop at that. Then we took these topologies and analyzed whether within this specific community this was happening in each and every community. And it was data proved that depending on the type of mobility that you were taking, the integration in the city was kind of differing as well. Okay, so the second part of the presentation, I will talk about major concepts of social network analysis. So one indicator that we use when we study social network analysis is the network size. So this can give us, it's an indicator, it's a basic indicator, but it can give us a lot of data. For instance, in a study they did after the Hurricane Andrew, individuals who had received more social support experience better physical health. So just by looking at the number of people receiving social support, you can give an idea of people who might eventually have better physical health and lower levels of depression. It can be used to see how the number of people, as I showed you before, the number of people live, the number of alters that you mentioned who are living in Seville. So it can give you indication of integration, it can give you indication of popularity or range of social support. So it can give you quite, and there is this, the American General Social Survey study, the first time they introduced a social network in '85, they introduced a social network indicator in their survey, and they asked who are the people you confine to when you are in a difficult situation, and they found that the number was like 2.94, almost 3 people, and then they repeated the study 10 years later, and then the number had decreased to 2.06. So it's 2 people. And then there was this big debate in the late 80s and 90s about the decline of community in the States. This is Bowling Alone by Putzman, the famous book of the collapse of the community. And there it just gives you indication that, so the number gives you an indication of things that are happening in the network. Okay, another indicator that we use is average distance. There are various types of average distance. I choose 4 to summarize my presentation. So the distributed kind of network is, if I remove one node from this network, the network does not break. So there are various routes to get through this network without the breaking of one node. The tree kind of network, which we will see a study now using this kind of topology, if I remove one network, it's more hierarchical. If I remove one node, the network might collapse. And this can have an important indication. This was the reason why the internet became decentralized, by the way. When America discovered that there might be missiles in Cuba, the network was still a centralized network. So if one node would have been blown away, the internet would have, the ARPANET at the time, would have been kind of dissolved. So they decided to decentralize the network. But the kind of decentralized network is a topology that is used in many kind of research. The small world typology is there are a lot of clusters and they are connected by some bridges. Again, if these bridges are taken away, the clusters will be kind of dispersed. So there might be something happening also in the different clusters, but you have to you have to take note of these bridges who might be very important in this kind of network. And then the core periphery, where you have a lot of density in the center and nodes on the periphery. I will give you some examples of these. So but I want to show you before, so when I give you the example, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is an example of identifying conflict. The context is a karate club and a professor and a student. But it's an example to show that you can identify conflict in any context. So the most interesting thing about this graph is that you see 34 and 1 are extremely central. There are many people connected to these people, but interestingly, 34 and 1 are not connected between themselves. So this kind of shows you that there might be a conflict in this network. So eventually, 34 and 1 had a big fight, and they became 2 different clubs. But this kind of network was already giving you indication that this might happen. So in the end, they became two separate networks. And in this kind of visualization, you can already identify certain things. So kind of gives you idea to predict certain evolution that might happen in the community. Okay, another metric that you use is density and components. So density, we look at how dense, how connected the network, the nodes are between themselves. And the opposite would be a sparse network, so the other graph. But even when you have a sparse network, there might be one component which is very densely connected. So this is an example that we're going to see now. Okay, so this is an example by a study that was conducted over an 18-month period in an American high school. It studied whether students had a sexual relationship between one another over the 18-month period. So if they, at some point, they had a sexual relationship, they would already be connected, no? And what was the most striking feature of this graph is that there is one single component up here, which connected 52% of the network, so 288 students, that's of romantically involved students. The results show that unlike adults, where normally when you're trying to intervene with the adult population, you have a core group of sexually active people, so you might have to intervene with these people and not with the entire population. And this is what, when the researchers set up to study this population, they thought this would be what they would study eventually. They needed to identify the core group who they. This was done to avoid sexually transmitted diseases. So they wanted to identify the core group, and they were surprised that actually, in a major component, almost the whole a huge part of the population was connected. And for the students, it was also quite surprising. They may have had one single partner over this time period, over this 18-month period, but without realizing be part of a large component. And even though they weren't being promiscuous, they had a still high risk of encountering sexually transmitted diseases. So this is just an example to show you how sometimes one component, so this is a dispersed network, no? But there is one component which really tells you quite a lot. It's the tree-like, what we saw before. It's a tree-like topology, and it just shows you in this context. It just shows you that it's not. It was quite surprising for both the researcher and for the research. So if you want to intervene with this kind of group, you have to intervene with the entire population. Okay, so the last metric that I will show you, there are 4 centrality metrics. Perhaps this is the metric we most use in social network analysis. The first one refers to degree centrality. So here we are looking at the actors which are mostly connected in the network. We use it to find very connected individuals, popular individuals, individuals who are likely to hold most information, or individuals who can quickly connect with each other. And then there is another one which is between a centrality, and this is the frequency with which an actor acts as in an intermediary position. So we use it to find individuals who can influence the flow around the system. I will give you some examples. So this is an example from the tobacco control industry. And it was quite interesting because you can see, like, these are the agencies, NGOs working in this area, and these are different states. So this is in Indiana, where there is a supportive climate, and in Oklahoma, where there is a challenging climate. And here you can see that ITPC is the central node. So the black one we are using between a centrality here. The researcher uses between a centrality. So ITPC has a high between a centrality, and TUPS, Latino, and ACS. So in this graph, where there is a supported climate, there is one NGO who has a central highest between a centrality, and in the challenging climate, there are three NGOs which have a high between a centrality. And the researcher kind of interpret this result in the way that when there is a supportive climate, where there is money, and it's an easy climate to work in, the NGO kind of allow for one NGO to take the lead. On the other hand, when there is a challenging climate where there is limited resources of finance, you start getting more NGOs trying to be central in the node, because they kind of start losing a bit trust in the main agency, taking the centrality role. So this is just an example from as well another industry, but when you look at the intervention, you can see that if you want to intervene in a challenging climate, you have to look at not one central, or if you want to disseminate information, you might not go to one NGO, but you might have to go to three. So this is just an example of between a centrality. The other two metrics that we use are closeness centrality. So we use this metric based on the closeness, looking at the measures scored by each node and based on their closeness to other nodes. So we use it to find the individual who are best placed to influence the entire network. So, for instance, the example from yesterday from your presentation, if you want to disseminate information, you might have to look at the people with the highest closeness centrality. And the eigenvector centrality is, now here we're not, it's like the same as the degree centrality, so we are looking at the people who are mostly connected, but we are not only looking at the links that they have, but also how well connected are the nodes that link to them. I'm going to give you an example of this. Okay, so this is a huge longitudinal study conducted with 5,000 people. It's one of the first studies that kind of predicted that just through network characteristics you could predict whether people will become happy or not. It's a study that was conducted over 20 years, so it's a one of the biggest longitudinal studies we have. And they found that that people who were happy, they had like 3 degrees of separation. So if you are happy, you can influence the friends of your friends of your friends of your friends. So with 3 degrees of separation. And this was quite interesting. They used eigenvectors, so because they were interested not only how the happy people were connected between each other, but also how happy those people were. So not just who was connected to who, but also who that node is, that the level of happiness of that node. And this was quite interesting for a clinical intervention. If you want to increase the person of one person, you can have cascading effects on the other. The same authors did the similar study on obesity and smoking, and they found similar patterns. Okay, so I give you some applications. Maya Yariego has written this great paper on some application of network analysis in the community intervention, which I think could be useful in the context of the seminar. So I'm just going to go through this very quickly, but you can identify central agents. So these will be well-connected people contributing to the efficient dissemination of message. Through this, you can prevent power, so kind of selection of leaders, using centrality, intermediary, key players. You can also look at community coalitions, so inter-organization and networks, like we saw with the tobacco industry, to improve coordination, increase effectiveness. So here you can look at topology, center-periphery structure, intermediation roles. You can also look at self-help groups and self-help in itself, exchange of support, coping strategies. So here you can look at small group interaction networks, can identify key role of close friends, support provided with greater multiplicity, so people who give you more than one type of support. You can also look at person and networks in the community, so study of the immediate network. I'm going to give you some examples now in the last part of the presentation, or identify risk and protection factors. So you can see this through topologies of person and network, or through identifying psychosocial processes. And you can also use network analysis to monitor implementation of a program, so an intervention program. You can do examination of the interactions that occur during the implementation of the program, both formal and informal. And analysis of intermediaries and the transfer chains of evidence-based practices or exchange between participants. Okay, so the last part is some proposals I give for how networks can be used as a tool for humanitarian protection. Some of the these proposals are here to be discussed. So this is the idea that Enrique will be discussing in this area, and also to open the floor and to kind of give you some ideas, which I hope you will take further, because you know the area much more than I do. So I think it will just to start the stone rolling, and hopefully, and also you can give more content to this part, let's say. So if we think of network analysis for social and community intervention, I think there are three aspects that we have to take into account. So the context, you have to look into, before intervention, you have to look into the context. And then you have two dynamics that are at interplay. You have the micro-social dynamics and the macro-social dynamics. So I kind of divided my proposals into three areas. So how you can intervene at the individual level, how you can intervene at the community level, and how you can intervene at the organizational level. Okay, so at the individual level, so Thomaso and all, when they did a study on the resilience of urban refugees in Nepal, found that in the void of institutional recognition, so when the people had no paper documenting, having formal documentation, they kind of found resilience by knowing that they have a close network that was supporting them. So this is just to show you that becoming conscious of the network around you can have quite an empowering effect. And this is exactly my second point, that networks could be used as a way of empowering people. So it can be used to make people understand the social support that they have at their disposal, or to predict the consequences of the specific network structure that they might have. I will give you some examples. So in a homogeneous network, there is a limited variety of available resources. So if a displaced individual is trying to look for a job, relying on the information of the network around him or her, will have some limited data, because it's the same for any person. If you're looking for a job, you will probably, this is the theory of Granovetter, the strength of weak ties. If you're looking for a job, you probably will get that information from the network which is outside of your network. So second separation network. So having a network, if there is a homogeneous network, it's important to explain to this person that they might need to expand the network to try and get their resources that they don't have in their network. So in a study carried out by Kingsbury and Dole on resettled refugee women during their pregnancies in the US, they found that personal networks were highly compromised of family connections. And they found this to be limiting because many of these pregnant women, they didn't have any connections with the health sector, for instance. So if they needed to go, if they needed some advice, some like health-related advice, they were kind of limited. So, so improving the capacity to develop diverse connections can have a potential to vastly improve one's network, and in this case, the resettlement experience. On the other hand, if an egocentric network is densely connected, then communication may be very efficient to disseminate. So the same homogeneous network can also have some positive aspect. So if you want to disseminate something very quickly, it might be better if you have a community which is highly densely connected, because it's much quicker for you to disseminate information. So so during a disaster, it's quite a densely connected network would work better, So, for instance, after a disaster, you have a lot of atypical structure in the networks. There is a high demand of new types of links, example, collaboration or resource sharing, so that are specific to disaster response and recovery. So people might have difficulties in identify who in their network could provide such resources. So utilizing person and network to empower these people to try to help them allocate where these resources are could be quite important. you can also use network visualizations to make people kind of become conscious of how their network structure is. Many people have not seen their networks before, and when people, especially if there is a disaster, if there is a displacement, their network change suddenly. So while before you had a network which is very, very, very structured and very clear to you, you have your family around, you have your neighbors, you have close friends or friends you can rely to. All of a sudden, this network changes, and you are in another kind of network with people who are trying to provide you resources, who are people who are trying to help you. So becoming aware of where you can ask for help if you need it is a way of helping people through the use of network analysis. So at the individual level, personal networks can as well how networks evolve not only through time but also because of critical events. So Wissing and Matsukuto found that in their study with irregular migrants residing in transit migration hubs in Turkey and Greece, they found that the people they were doing kind of trying to understand the evolution of networks, so doing kind of a longitudinal study, how networks were evolving through time. And we always assume that networks change because of somebody's displacement, no? So like I was explaining before. But in their study, they found that a critical event can also really change your network. So for instance, they found the people who are at the borders and just the influx of other refugees arriving or going were completely changing the networks of these people. So these are critical events which are outside of your control and not necessarily linked to the person doing something, so changing location, but critical events happening outside and changing the person's network. So in the case, for instance, of displaced individual networks may be insightful in depicting the transnational network as well. So when they move, they might still have connections with the people back at home, or they might be also connected with people in Europe who might need to rely on for financial assistance. And sometimes the use of social media or mobile or email is a way of capturing that transnational network. Perhaps some people are not even aware of that. It's not that they are not aware that they don't have that person in contact in Germany, but making the network visible can kind of there's a lot of research that show that just knowing that you have social support at your disposal has a lot of positive health outcomes. So this is just another example. Personal networks may enable agencies to support workers to develop intervention strategies which enable people to expand their networks or enhance specific area in the network. So example, in the case of refugees, to develop self-protection, so being able through networks to assess and determine the best strategies to avoid, mitigate, or thwart violence by armed forces, for example, or reconstruct, so help people reconstruct their personal networks, example following a natural disaster such as tsunami. And as well to develop resilience. And networks could be used, as we saw in the study by Thomas, could be a way of helping people to develop resilience. So finally, at the community level, social network could be used as a tool to enable better understanding of the structure of the community. So when you arrive at a new community, it is very important, at least from our experience from community intervention, to first understand the structure of the community, how the community works. It could also be used to monitor how a community evolves through longitudinal studies. So this could be done over time, how the community structure has changed after a year, or following a crisis, how has the community changed following a flood, or following intervention, so how has the community changed after specific action programs have been implemented. The structure of the community can provide insight on where intervention is needed. For instance, in a community where information from outside is paramount, a highly dense community connected through one person or two nodes could lead to a critical situation if that highly connected person is killed or taken away. So this is an example of understanding how the structure of the community it operates, and finding the best possible way to intervene according to the existing structure of the community. And you can also use network maps, like from the Roundtree Foundation, the study that I showed you where they were using maps to understand how a community moves within a specific location, also to identify places of danger, hubs in terms of community interaction, and spaces which are important for community leaders. So for instance, in the event of a flood, where do people move? So knowing where the people need to move is a way of being able to use knowing that the people have a structure and already have kind of some coordination on knowing where they have to move if there is a flood, or who they can rely to for different kinds of support. Another example would be to identify secure or dangerous locations in a refugee camp where women already have reported previously sexual violence. And social network analysis could be used as a tool to understand the context where a project will be implemented or intervention, the role and position of the agents, so NGOs, UN, government bodies, and where protection is already taking place. So this will contribute to have a more comprehensive view of the agents involved, as in the example with the tobacco industry, the role and the influence they have on each other, and also to try and highlight conflict that already exists between some agents that are already in the location, and also the evolution of a situation over a different period of time. Networks can be used as a... so this is the same, okay. So finally, some issues to consider when using social network analysis is trust. In this context, trust is a major issue. It was mentioned, in fact, yesterday. People are not, interviewees might not be trusting the interviewer who is collecting the data. You have to really explain various times and repeat it during the data collection why you are collecting this kind of data, because people are not, they have been through various critical situations where they have lost trust through their trajectory. I'm thinking of a displaced individual as an example. So establishing a trusting relationship is really of fundamental importance if you want to use social network analysis, especially if you want to use person and network analysis as an approach. Another issue is confidentiality. Many people, as we have found out in our migration study, many people who have not perhaps all their papers in place, or they are waiting papers, they might not want to confine who is in their network, because there might be people in their network who are confidential. And if they reveal that kind of information, their network can become, they can be in a dangerous situation. So there might be, when you are collecting this kind of data, you have to be aware that perhaps that network is not 100% accurate, and people are leaving out some information just to protect themselves as a means of self-protection. Language could also be a problem if you want to use a kind of a more qualitative data collection, it could be a problem. But as well, there was a study where this researcher conducted with young immigrant children in Germany who did not speak German, and they used maps to draw where they moved in the community. And it was quite interesting because these people could not speak German, very fluent German yet, and the researcher used this kind of approach to be able to collect data from these children, and the drawings really said a lot about just by the mobility where these children moved, show how well they were integrated in the location where they were living. And it could be used in this way. Language can be limiting, but it could also be a way of going a way of going beyond language problems if you use, for instance, drawing, network drawing, and perhaps work with an interpreter or somebody who's translating. And time is one of the major issues. Network analysis is really time consuming. You can use means and tactics, different tactics of how to make your research question and your name generator, when you're generating the names, asking the people to tell you the names. There are different ways of how to make a representative sample, and keeping the questions very limiting so as to not spend all the time collecting names, and then people are really tired. And many times people are not willing to, you are working into in situations where people are not willing to perhaps spend that much time with you as a researcher. Okay, these are some of my ideas for the session. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope the presentation is useful for the work that you are doing. Thank you.